Hello, and welcome again to the Writer Review. This is Eric Writer, and this week we're going to be taking a look back at the 1991 psychological thriller titled Sleeping with the Enemy. Now, Sleeping with the Enemy runs for 1 hour and 37 minutes long. It is directed by Joseph Ruben. It is produced by Leonard Goldberg. The script was written by Ronald Bass and Bruce Joel Ruben. Now all of a sudden, I guess you could say I now have a craving for a Reuben sandwich. But I'll just wait for that to come a little bit later on. Okay, yes, the script was written by Ronald Bass and Bruce Joel Ruben. It is based off of a novel under the penmanship of Nancy Price, also called Sleeping with the Enemy. The score was done by Jerry Goldsmith, the cinematography by John Lindley, and the editing was done by George Bowers. And the stars of the movie are Julia Roberts, Patrick Bergin, Kevin Anderson, Elizabeth Lawrence, Harley Venton, Sandi Shakleford, and Bonnie Johnson. Well, what could I say about this movie? You know, like most psychological thrillers, they seem to have their series of hits and misses. This one had potential to have a lot of hits, but unfortunately, there were just a lot of misses in this too. I mean, the opening scenes to Sleeping with the Enemy packs a very powerful punch. If only I could say the same about the rest of the movie. Sadly, I really can't, because everything else just falls flat. The film delves into the life of a poor, beaten, misfortunate trophy wife named Laura Burney, played by Julia Roberts. And then it ends with another tiring cliche in which the villain hoodwinks his target and downplays his audience. The performances were really good here, make no mistake about it, but the filmmakers offer little to showcase their talents. Instead, the film is only in it for the cheap scares. Okay, so with the exception of Julia Roberts being the only really big-time major star here, you don't see any other like well-known household names in this movie. I think this was actually the very first American film from Patrick Bergin, being the fact that he was actually born in Ireland. So this was his first American debut. I don't know. This movie tries everything in its power to be sort of like all these other 90s themed characters from hell. I mean, you had, of course, the home care nurse from hell, Annie Wilkes from Misery, which was probably one of the most successful of the 90s versions of the psychological thriller. Hell, you had The Hand That Rocks the Cradle, where Rebecca De Mornay was a real badass. Unlawful Entry, Ray Liotta. I mean, that guy with his icy, cold, blue eyes is enough to really send chills down your spine. Hell, even Macaulay Culkin tried his hands at a psychological thriller by being an evil version of Kevin McAllister in The Good Son. I mean, there were probably a lot of other ones too. I mean, this one tried to be almost like, who could forget Single White Female, Jennifer Jason Leigh, the roommate from hell. This movie tried its luck to try to copy all of these other like psychological thrillers But unfortunately, it just didn't really succeed or live up to its expectations. Because obviously the budget was cheap, and also the final scenes was forced, cliched, and cheap. Everything about this movie reminds me of going to a farm and visiting the chicken coop, and all the chickens are just going cheep, cheep, cheep. Because everything about this movie is cheap. Cheap, cheap, cheapity cheap. So after coming off the success of Pretty Woman, Julia Roberts decides to go out of the romantic comedy drama to take part in a B-movie thriller without thinking about how absurd this movie really is. So she and her wealthy, sophisticated business tycoon husband, Martin, played by Patrick Bergin, live in a nice upper crust dwelling somewhere. However, most of their scenes emanate from a summer estate near a beach, and the epicenter of Martin's reign of terror commences. The opening scenes take place in this summer home near the beach. Everything looks pristine and gorgeous, almost like living in paradise. I mean, it feels like a paradise. But however, Laura just doesn't feel the paradise within her because of the fact that she's practically sleeping with the enemy. And if you don't know who the enemy is, it's not an old school bully. It's not a sibling. No, she is sleeping with her most feared enemy. And that enemy happens to be her husband, Martin. That's right. Hence the title, Sleeping with the Enemy. She is sleeping around with somebody who she doesn't like. And it leads me up to this kind of question, like, what the fuck did she ever see in him? Well, okay, he's got some of the outer qualities. I mean, hey, he's rich, he's sophisticated, he's handsome, he seems to be the charmer, he seems to be the life of the parties, even though she's basically just used as a trophy case for his toxic masculinity. And that's basically what her role is. But back home, it's anything but a paradise. The guy is he has some kind of obsessive compulsiveness. Everything has to be in a particular order or else he'll go ballistic. If you don't match his socks properly, he'll go fucking ape shit over it. If you don't stack the kitchen condiments in a certain area, his head will fucking explode. I mean, this guy is a crazy loon. And it's also been known that he has also been not only verbally abusive towards her, but also physically abusive. But I'll tell you something about Laura is that she doesn't always play fair game either. She may manipulate you into thinking that she's a victim, but in reality, she actually seems to always be somewhat one step ahead of him. Yes, I know she kind of gives you the impression that she seems mousy and vulnerable and submissive. But then we realize that in later scenes we discover that as the film rolls, she's anything but submissive. And that she actually has ways of outsmarting her husband. And she just seems to know when the right time is to escape from his wrath of fear. Which is basically a lot of the cornerstone of this movie. So Martin has a tendency to treat Laura like she's a possession of his and is made to be his servant pro bono. She's at his parties for him just to show off with because she's nice looking. But at home, she ends up as his personal whooping girl if she doesn't obey to his demands, making the guy an obsessive compulsive psycho. Even the smallest faux pas can make him go ballistic, like if the cans aren't stacked right or the towels are not folded in a certain way. She can't even choose her own clothing. She can't be seen with other people. In other words, she's definitely a prison in her own home. Like I said, what did she ever saw in him to begin with? The first time he strikes at her, the impact is enough to make the heart pound faster. I mean, like I said before, I didn't have a problem with the acting. Patrick Bergin was definitely excellent as the crazed psychopath. While the film does make the effort to add some dramatic pathos for this psychological thriller, it definitely quickly lowers the expectancy for fans who loved psycho thrillers. It's just not at the same level as some of the other psychological thrillers that was big in the 90s. But she seems to be somewhat very clever and also has some great ways of trying to escape this guy's wrath. One day, he and his friends decide to go fishing by the lake at night. Of course, she's also going to be coming there too with them. So then all of a sudden, a big storm appears at sea. And it was led to believe that Laura accidentally must have fell overboard. And Martin believes that Laura had succumbed to her death by drowning. Because apparently we are led to believe that Laura does not know how to swim. So we're led to believe that she died from drowning because of the storm and because of her going overboard. But then we also later come to believe that, we're led to the fact that Laura actually does know how to swim. And that she's actually had been secretly taking swimming lessons at the YWC, at a nearby YWCA, where she has membership. So she escapes his wrath by faking her death, packing her clothes, and taking off. Oh, and one last thing she did before she left. She removed her wedding ring and tossed it down the toilet. But there was one thing that she forgot to do. She forgot to flush the fucking ring down the toilet. But I will explain a little bit more to that as the plot goes on. So she decides to pack up, leave, and she moves to a new state. She also has gone from being Laura Bruni to Sarah Waters. She's now changed her name. She's now living in a modest middle-class house in Cedar Falls, Iowa. And she also is being close to her mother, her blind mother, who's now being, under hospital care now, permanent hospital care. Because not only is her mother blind, I guess she's also borderline senile. Yeah, that's what happens when you get old. And then now she is living by herself in a modest house. She's also took up a job in the library or something like that. I'm not sure if she's a librarian per se or just a clerk. She's also while she's there, she also befriends a drama professor at the University of Iowa who goes by the name of Ben Woodward, played by Kevin Anderson. And of course, he tries to wow her and tries to sort of play off this kind of white knight character. And every time he wanted to try to see if he could get intimate with her, she kind of rejects his offer. Not because she's trying to be aloof or anything, but because even though she has gotten away from Martin, she still sometimes fears that this may backfire. She's still very insecure about trying to start a new relationship, which is understanding. But I guess it's her approaches that kind of somewhat seems to be a little mucked up. And for some reason or another, I don't really even trust this Ben Woodward character either. It seems like he always seems to somewhat be present at her at all times. And sometimes he even just sneaks into her house without either ringing the bell or knocking. Which is actually, believe it or not, kind of creepy. Even though he's kind of playing this white knight. And then as time goes on, he also begins to realize that she's not really Sarah Waters, and that there's something else that just does not seem right with Laura, or in her case now, she's Sarah. Oh, and eventually her web of lies eventually catches on to Martin. So now Martin is on his pursuit to get even with Laura. So Laura eventually goes incognito as a form. I mean, this movie definitely goes incognito as nothing more than a formulaic slasher film, and definitely falls under the rather repetitive format for our heroine trying to escape her problems, only to realize it's not as easy as it seems. So Laura hides out in Iowa, changes her name to Sarah Waters, but before she does that, she fakes her death by pretending she's drowning while she was on the yacht with Martin. However, Martin is not going to take this lying down. It becomes his mission to track her down and to find her and looking for places she might have been. Of course, a plethora of incoherent clues leads Martin to her whereabouts, which leaves this critic with questions that are greatly neglected. Yes, this is one of the reasons why this movie doesn't really work well, is because there's a lot of stuff that's so incoherent, it leaves you wondering. And it leaves you with a lot of questions in which many of them will not be fulfilled or fully answered. There are definitely some well-groomed scenes that take place in Iowa, which includes Laura progressively getting attached with a kindly neighbor who's a drama teacher named Ben Woodward, played by Kevin Anderson, which, like I said, he kind of seems to somewhat strike me as being a creepy stalker kind of guy himself. I mean, sneaking in on people's rooms, coming in from out of nowhere. What makes you probably think that Laura should trust this guy, too. Sadly, director Joseph Ruben and screenwriter Ronald Bass demote this great chemistry between these two as a mere set piece for all the horror garbage soon to come. Ruben came strong in the 1987 horror film The Stepfather, about a man who marries a woman, kills her and her children, and gains possession of their belongings. But here, with a dependable cast and a surplus budget, Ruben decides to let himself go and let his cast do their thing, which is irresponsible to his part. It's definitely lazy direction, and it almost looks as though as if the actors and actresses in this movie are either pretty much ad-libbing or they really just don't have very much to do in terms of their actions. You know, for a psychological thriller, there seems to be very little dialogue, and there also seems to be very little in terms of action, which leaves everything seem to be rather unfulfilling. And it's a shame how an opening scene starts off so strongly, only to end up going downhill so swiftly. But I guess that's the way the cookie crumbles. The real turnoff for me is when Martin starts going on his witch hunts to trace down the whereabouts of Laura. It was the clues that got to me, which was left with holes galore. The plot logic is definitely very puzzling and incoherent. How could a wedding ring be stuck in a toilet in a matter of weeks? I mean, where does Martin go to take a shit? Unless his paradise home has more than one bathroom. How did the YWCA employee get Martin's work phone number when really they had little to no connections with Martin? You know, a few other questions that are definitely leads me to wondering, what the hell am I seeing? How do you explain Laura paying the nursing home bill 6 months after lying to her husband that her mother died? How is it possible for Martin to know where Laura lived before she ever met him? Why do we even care for all that to matter? We'll never get any answers because even the filmmakers don't seem to know either. And the filmmakers don't know, then how the hell should we know? What we're left with is the impression that Martin is definitely a deranged lunatic with a weakness for neatness. But still, is it possible for a man with one thing on his mind to kill Laura and still manage to arrange his cupboards? The simple answer that it's not to define logic, but just to get the cheap shock. So I decided to just throw away logic, throw away common sense, throw away anything that could be deemed plausible, and to just go with the flow, take it like a grain of salt, and just forget about all the inconsistencies in this movie, because that's kind of like the impression I kind of get. But then what about Laura? What would you do if you're alone in a house and knowing your insane husband's dropping by for a killing visit? And to wrap things up, we have probably one of the lamest attempts of ending a film. I don't know. Was Mr. Ruben out of resources? Was he out of film? Was he on a tight budget, a tight time restraint? Because the ending was just so freaking convoluted that it just ends so abruptly. So here we have the villain dies, or at least at first we assume he's dead, only for him to die, but eventually gives in. It's like Laura picks up the gun, she shoots him, he's dead, or at least we assume he's dead. But then we realize that he was just playing possum. And then when it looks like he's almost ready to pop her, he decides to say, okay, fuck you, you got me. It's like, that's how it ends. Which is actually quite a cliche. One minute you think he's dead, then he gets up, and then he's like, oh, fuck it, and then he dies. So I guess now Julia and Ben can now be in each other's arms, and they can all live happily ever after. And then you ask yourself, then what? Is it going to be a happy ending? Are these two lovebirds going to tie the knot or something? I don't know. And the point is, do we even care? Because I sure don't. I mean, if the filmmakers don't care, why should we? And though Sleeping with the Enemy, this might seem like a complete rant, but it's not really that badly of a rant. I can't recommend it, but I will say one thing. Sleeping with the Enemy definitely has a lot of good going for it, but it decides to go down a narrow path of slasher film cliches. It wants to try to make itself more intelligent than a slasher film, but in the end, Patrick Bergin's character is pretty much almost like a slasher film villain. It's like he appears out of nowhere. The heroes outsmart him. And then when he catches on, the hero kills him. Only for him to get up again. Just to die. That's it. Very anticlimactic ending. But then again, the movie itself was anticlimactic. I can't really recommend this movie. I'm really, really sorry. I mean, there are far more better slasher movies out there that you can watch. This one didn't sit very well. So when all said and done, if I was to give a score out of 10, I would give Sleeping with the Enemy a 5. So I guess this ends my writer review. Thank you all for listening in. If you wish to subscribe to my channel, please feel free to do so. If you wish to leave a comment, go right ahead. But just remember the 3 simple rules. Be kind, be courteous, and don't be rude. And I will be back again with another movie review. So until next time, this is Eric Red Writer saying, keep watching those movies, and I'll see you around. Goodbye.